Richard Rosebeale Preston John writes, I cannot understand why each community cannot choose Latin or not. Latin is not suitable for children, as I lived through that and never understood a word. You're absolutely right. This is again. I'm just answering questions about the issue of the Latin Tridentine Mass and the confusion between Latin and the Tridentine Rite. And the I think it's important to untangle the confusion. The notion that the so-called Tridentine Mass is equivalent to the Latin Mass is not the case. One should begin by drawing a necessary distinction between language and rite. And the former is the vehicle, the latter is the architecture. The Tridentine Rite, or more properly, the traditional Roman Rite, has historically been celebrated in Latin, yes, but Latin is not intrinsic to its theological or its liturgical validity. It's simply the language of its original codification, because Latin is the language of the Vatican. The Mass promulgated by Pope Pius V in 1570, following the Council of Trent, was not a new invention, but a consolidation of the Roman usage that had evolved gradually over the centuries, and exceptions were automatically written into the Rite, like the Sarum traditions, which continued in a few places in the UK. What Pius V did was to issue a universal Missale Romanum, mandating its use throughout the Latin Church unless a local rite could claim 200 years of continuous use. And the Missal was in Latin not because the Council had anathematized vernacular languages per se, but because Latin was the normative language of the Western Church. Canon 9 of Session 22 of Trent states clearly, "Siquis dixerit, lingua tantum vulgari missam celebrare debere anathema sit." If anyone says the Mass should only be celebrated in the vernacular, let him be anathema. This is a rejection of exclusivity, not of the vernacular itself. So, contrary to popular opinion, Trent did not ban the vernacular. It simply reasserted that Latin was appropriate and fitting, and that the Rite's sacrificial and sacred character need not be diluted by a populist turn of phrase. Now, if you examine the significant, though exceptional, uses of the Tridentine Rite in other languages, for example, the Church Slavonic in regions such as Dalmatia and parts of Croatia, the Holy See permitted the Roman Rite to be celebrated in other languages, in Old Slavonic. This wasn't an indult, but a recognition of long-standing custom. Printed missals existed in Cyrillic, and this usage continued into the 20th century. The Jesuits in China, particularly under the influence of Matteo Ricci, made tentative efforts to translate liturgical texts into Mandarin, and while this was never universalized, a Chinese language Tridentine Missal was printed, and other historical languages exist. There are records of altar missals printed in Greek, Armenian, Syriac, even Persian, largely for missionary purposes and always with Roman approval. One might also include the English Missal, used by Anglo-Catholics, which closely mirrors the Roman Rite, merely translated into the idiom of Cranmer and Coverdale. While unofficial from Rome's perspective, it's a fine demonstration that the form of the Rite could survive translation. And the modern phrase Latin Mass is unhelpful and inaccurate. The Novus Ordo of Paul VI can be said in Latin, the Tridentine Rite can theoretically be said in English, and the key distinction is not language, but the structure, the rubrics, the theology, and the ceremonial expression of the liturgy. What is currently restricted under the Traditionis Custodes and other papal decrees is not Latin, but the 1962 Missal of John the 23rd, the last version of the Tridentine Rite. In short, the rite is under restriction, not the language. Therefore, the real debate is not Latin versus vernacular, but Tridentine versus post-Vatican II liturgy. That is the Roman Rite before and after 1969. And there are those who propose we reclaim the term the Mass of St. Gregory the Great, highlighting its patristic and liturgical heritage. And this would be both historically accurate and less politically fraught than Tridentine or Latin Mass. And the current liturgical tension is not a conflict of tongues, but of visions of the sacred and of the choreography of the ritual itself. Latin, being a dead language, has long been valued for its precision and its immutability, but that's not enough to define the identity of a religious rite. What traditionalists seek, I think, is not simply the sound of Latin, but the gesture of mystery, reverence, and a verticality of worship, which they feel is lacking in many celebrations of the Novus Ordo, even when said in Latin. So I think we need absolutely to retire the notion that the debate is about Latin. It's a straw man, and the real question is whether the older form of the Roman Rite, whether it's with its Gregorian prayers, offertory rubrics, and sacral ethos, that should have a continued place in the liturgical life of the modern Catholic Church. That's the issue. It was never just Latin that moved hearts. It was the silence, the orientation, the ritual, the theology of transcendence, which parallels the theologies of the Eastern traditions, which still have a role in the Catholic in the Catholic rites of the Eastern Catholic churches. The Tridentine Rite is not simply a museum piece of ecclesiastical Latin, it's a vessel of memory and sanctity. And the sooner we speak of rites rather than languages, the sooner we can clarify the conversation and perhaps elevate it to something that can that can actually have real meaning. But the media obsession with language is an obsession which is misdirected.